Welcome to the 18th video in the series, Foundations of Communist Organizing. Today we'll be going over the 1920 piece by the Third Communist International Second Congress, Theses on the National and Colonial Question, which I have summarized as Colonial Liberation led by Communists ignites Global Proletarian Revolution chain. In this text, the International criticizes the Second International's chauvinistic, Eurocentric position, and instead centers the conditions of colonies and imperialized nations in terms of the struggle for socialism, laying out the stances the international proletariat, especially those within the imperial core, should take. The International is the concentrated will of the world revolutionary proletariat and aims to organize the working class of the whole world. It acts as a fighting body to combine all revolutionary forces of all countries, giving moral and material aid to such movements and colonies on the basis that colonialism hinders the development of social forces in victim nations, thus making the liberation of imperialized nations the first step towards revolution in them and also in the imperial core as well. Note, calling for the liberation of imperialized nations is not endorsing nationalist aspirations, but instead has the purpose of opening the way for the national proletariat to be able to engage in class struggle instead of a national struggle. The Communist Party bases its positions not in calls for pacifism, but in a precise analysis of the specific historical situation and economic conditions, which shows a clear distinction between 1. The interests of the oppressed classes and the general concept of national interests as a whole, which necessarily translates to the interests of the ruling class. 2. The oppressed, dependent, and subject nations and the oppressing, exploiting, and sovereign nations. And 3. From this, it becomes clear that the party must make things explicit and propagandize and agitate on their basis in order to show the reality of colonialism and imperialism, and thereby their basis in capital. Liberation of oppressed nations requires close unity between all liberation movements in principle and fact in terms of 1. Military alliance, 2. Economic alliance to develop productive forces, and 3. Trend towards the creation of a single world economy that is regulated by the proletariat of all nations as an integral whole and according to a common plan. The good old joint dictatorship of the proletariat of the oppressed nations, but let's just do joint dictatorship of the proletariat of the entire world is hopefully the case. The Communist International must make its economic basis in liberation, as no oppressed nation will have interest in entering an economic alliance which furthers their oppression. It must engage in propaganda, agitation, and real material action in supporting equality of nations, while exposing the nature of imperialism and the oppression of minorities, and lay out the solution: the creation of a united international proletariat which engages in class struggle against the whole of the bourgeoisie by way of all communist parties materially supporting revolutionary movements within dependent and underprivileged nations, while imperialists ones struggle internally. This supports the creation of a Soviet system, which can ensure genuine equality of nations in deed and not word. The International must reject all social chauvinistic, petty bourgeois nationalism, as such positions preserve national self-interest. It calls instead for proletarian internationalism, which demands 1. The interests of the proletarian struggle in all nations be subordinated to the worldwide struggle, and 2. Any nation achieving victory over the bourgeoisie should be able and willing to make the greatest national sacrifices for the overthrow of international capital. And just want to put this out here, if they don't do that, then they might as well not even bother, because they will collapse. There is no socialism in one country. There is no socialist nation surviving, or dictatorship of the proletariat surviving. If you are not growing, you are dying. You must be able to expand. Nations that have fully developed capitalist relations and have parties that act as vanguards for their national working class must make the struggle against opportunism and social chauvinism a primary task. In imperialized nations, distrust towards the proletariat of imperialist nations is only able to be removed when imperialism is overthrown, but class-conscious communists of all such nations must combat nationalist sentiments of the revolutionary proletariat within colonized nations. Any concessions granted towards these sentiments should only be to those which will lead to rapid overcoming of this distrust. Ultimately, the worldwide proletariat must voluntarily strive for alliance and unity, with the right of seceding being maintained. Communist parties must support historically progressive movements in backwards nations, with workers from colonial nations being the leading international force against their own nation's colonialism. It is important to note that these historically progressive movements must not be allowed to take on the name of communism. Instead, an independent communist movement must be established in the midst of the national struggle, which creates the conditions for the class struggle to start the instant international capital is overthrown in a colonized nation. Thus, the International must propagandize to the masses the nature of imperialism and the character of Comradore states, so that the workers of such nations do not fall for the idea that a national bourgeois revolution is liberatory and remain in position to take over. In service of this, the International establishes relations with anti-imperialist forces which it coordinates with, to prepare for the overthrowing of imperialism, which will in turn cause imperialist nations to collapse as their existence is maintained by imperialism. If communist parties are prepared, then ending imperialism at this stage of capitalist development guarantees a victory of the proletariat. It aims to develop class consciousness in the working masses in the colonies, with the overthrow of foreign capital opening the path to class struggle, which transcends national struggle. During the national struggle, there's room for temporary alliance with national bourgeois revolutionary elements. Note, this is more questionable in a modern sense, and I'll get into why that is in just a little bit. However, during that struggle, the International must help the workers form their own worker councils in a communist party, which meets the requirements to be part of the International. Through this basis, the working masses in backwards countries can achieve communism not through capitalistic development, but through the internationalist leadership of the advanced socialist countries. Alright, so I'm done with the summary of the Third Communist International Second Congress theses on the national and colonial question, but I think it's actually of deep importance to get through some definitions and explanations here, namely about decolonization and namely about national liberation movements in the modern day. So to start with, let's go over decolonization movements and projects. First off, I want to say that decolonization is automatically, necessarily, completely within the communist movement. In a certain sense, communism doesn't even need to say decolonization because communism automatically implies and necessarily involves it. Decolonialism movements across the board, historically ignoring outliners with extremely spontaneous circumstances like the Haitian Revolution and the like, generally involve, firstly, the restoration of historic lands that hold cultural significance. This is distinct from reformist honoring of treaties or land back or whatever, which is often part of the platform for land back, which necessarily are produced from non-equal relations. These treaties were written in a period of subjection by the colonized peoples. Why are we trying to get back to that rather than to equal and proper relations? The treatment of land is already covered in the Communist Project. Engagement with specific culturally pertinent lands, less so. But all of this can be determined through associating proceedings to the next parts. 2. Rebuilding of land damaged by colonialism. All of it. Again, this is already part of the Communist Project, of course, in the form of rational agronomy. And 3. Integrating central roles politically and economically for the previously colonized peoples with reparations in kind, and granting self-determination. This, of course, is already part of the Communist Project. And then finally, 4th, usually kicking out those that resisted decolonization while granting quote-unquote honorary nationality to those who fought by your side. For example, the French Vietnamese freedom fighters. This is less viable in nations like America, where there have been hundreds of years of generations of colonizers. In Israel, in comparison, and we'll get into more in those terms in just a little bit, If every settler was kicked out, they could literally just go back home. Most of them own their own homes that they left and rent them out as landlords and the like. With American settlers, most are born in America and nobody has land back where they were ancestrally from. In this case, it'll be more likely to be similar to Soviet Russia's support of minorities. Colonialism is a living, active system which is maintained through the dominance and occupation of one nation over another one, officially recognized or not. It has an ideology both for the settlers and for the colonized. I recommend Frantz Fanon for this, though. He's not great with everything, but in this case, yes. There's absolutely a psychological and social situation with this. And particular organizations of the state, of culture, of identity and economic activity and the like to produce and reproduce itself, expanding in scope. Colonialism is a way of living. It's a social organization. It's a constant state of affairs with the principal goal of removing self-determination from the occupied peoples. And decolonization is specifically targeting that system which maintains that. The settlers might be a part of it, but don't make the mistake of thinking that simply kicking out the settlers will remove that system. Don't make the mistake of demands for a group of people to leave to be a genuine decolonial struggle. For example, the New African movement, right? Colonialism is necessarily a genocidal system in the ways it maintains itself, as a captive people must either stay second-class citizens, or they must naturalize into the colonizer systems, if they were even allowed to do so, by the way, because that's not always the case, which seeks to always destroy the basis for the occupied people to maintain their culture, ethnicity, and so on, so as to more fully subjugate them. Decolonization is ending genocide. Decolonization does not require the removal of all foreigners to create an ethno-state. It requires the ending of the colonial system, the creation of self-determination for everyone, the restoration of the basis for the social metabolism of a peoples, their land, their history, their culture, and so on. Once that occurs, settlers become immigrants, who can then peacefully join with comrades in arms as fellow and equal human beings. A situation that is impossible within a settler colonial society because settler colonialism is necessarily predicated on hierarchies of power and the domination of one nation over others which are repressed. Ending the colonial system means ending the domination hierarchy. It means bringing people together and allowing for communist society to exist. No communist society can maintain and have in any way, shape, or form colonization, much less settler colonialism. Despite many white supremacist colonialist fears, Vosh, fucking Vosh, I'm saying this out loud, I'm calling him out, you are a complete asshole. Get over yourself. Showing what they would do if they were granted power, by the way. Very few people I've seen demanded probably upwards of 1 billion people globally displaced, especially not for any designs on ethno-states. Now, for national liberation, and most pertinently given the current situation, Palestine. It's true that when genocide comes calling, the ruling class members of a given ethnicity tend to be able to jump ship more than the proletariat of said ethnicity. Genocidal intent tends to be a bit more pertinent, shall we say, than organizing the class towards revolutionary defeatism. The defeat of one's own nation is realistically only applicable if the other guy doesn't intend to Lebensraum manifest destiny for their own proletariat. Not that they're actually doing it for their own proletariat, they're doing it for their own national bourgeoisie, imperialist bourgeoisie, but their own national proletariat get the crumbs off the table and sections of them are okay with that. Like, look at Israel. The proletarian members of the Zionist state are all over this shit, and have historically been as well. The labor movement has been embedded with the Zionist movement in a completely shameful manner, because the immediate partial interests of sections of the proletariat can be sold to significant sections of a given proletarian group, heedless of their larger, more long-term and abstract class interests which can only reach fruition down the line. through communist revolution. There's fundamentally not room to engage in revolutionary defeatism in the face of genocide, unfortunately. And unfortunately, the bourgeoisie understand this, and that means that most every war is carried out with genocidal intent in modernity. In fact, every historical imperialist war is genocidal in character, if we want to be specific about it. Makes it so it's a ridiculous ask for anyone who's a victim of such aggression, regardless of the class contents of their nation, to seek their own defeat, followed by a rallying of the proletariat to protect the new burgeoning state. What this fundamentally means, since all imperialist wars trend towards genocide in order to, among other things, remove the basis for real class struggle, is that the proletariat of the imperialist nations need to have developed class consciousness more and fight more viciously with revolutionary defeatism, actively rejecting imperialist wars and carrying out all pressure on their governments that they possibly can in the name of internationalism. We can't ask the Palestinians and the like to carry out revolutionary defeatism as a tactic in these conditions. Instead, have to make up for the weaknesses of the communist movement through more principled action in stymieing our own nations, while utilizing the conflict and revolutionary defeatism in order to further develop the consciousness of the proletariat in a manner similar to, for example, Vietnam, but without the Vietnam War in America, but without the petite bourgeois hippie crap. What I'm saying is that for someone in a communist party acting on the ground, whatever their personal views and a particular struggle happening immediately, the long-term position, the position here that must be upheld is revolutionary defeatism. Regardless of whatever your feelings are here, I understand. But the party needs to take up the long-term correct position. There are also circumstances where one nation losing is better than another. We recognize that. For example, America is the arch-conservator of capitalism currently. Israel itself is and that might change in the near future, given current events, by the way. China is an upcoming imperialist capitalist state, right? That might essentially take the lead on that end. Israel itself is a major factor of reducing consciousness of the proletariat within the entire Middle Eastern region, as their bourgeoisie are able to rally the proletariat around fighting against it, like in Saudi Arabia and all these other nations which understand Israel is the great devil and all that sort of stuff. But instead, they need to be engaging in revolutionary defeatism against their own governments, which are Comradore, and support Israel. For the preference of communists from this perspective is 1. For internationalism to be strictly maintained. 2. For the proletariat of Palestine and Israel both to practice revolutionary defeatism with greater focus on Israel against their own bourgeois states while fraternizing with each other. And 3. The Palestinian proletarian organizing alongside national liberation movements in such a way that the instant victory is achieved, they can smash the nascent Palestinian bourgeois state and emerge as a proletarian state. This requires that the international proletariat support the proletarian factions of the struggle, with the proletarian factions taking the leading role in the national liberation struggle and acting autonomously, rather than being led by the bourgeois factions, most notably in this case, Hamas. Our goal as communists is not the creation of a new bourgeois state, but the creation of a proletarian one. If no war but class war is a serious principle rather than a slogan that is abandoned, then this is the conclusion, that the proletariat should support tactics which result in a new proletarian state, not movements that result in a new bourgeois one. So, but as discussed before, the conditions of genocide kind of make this quite difficult. Unfortunately, the liquidation of the proletariat in one nation for settlers' purposes has happened multiple times before. And while it comes out of bourgeois imperialism and would be resolved by the defeat of global capital, that will not happen fast enough in these sorts of circumstances. And as noted, the results of this is that imperialist wars all trend towards genocide in order to remove the basis for real class struggle and revolutionary defeatism, which makes the correct form of organizing too dangerous. The question here is how long we will be given to chase around and where we draw our lines. But the hope here is that the PLFP and other such organizations, or a new organization that is truly proletarian and rejects any sort of subordination to the bourgeois state within Palestine, takes up the leading role in the physical and ideological struggle, propagandizes amongst the workers, including against Hamas and against all other bourgeois factions, receives all international support from the international workers. This is another important thing. Acts in concert with the bourgeois factions until victory is at hand, while using its position as lead in the war in order to take political power away from the opportunists and collaborators, and when victory is at hand, carry out civil war with mass support, overthrowing the bourgeois factions. And this is actually what Russia did in the October Revolution, and in the actual seizure of power, I just want to say, only about 200 people died. It's only what happened afterwards as the entirety of the capitalist world went in and supported the reactionary forces in their attempt at counter-revolution after power was seized by the proletariat, that the deaths ramped up. This will firstly get out the Comradores, whereas Hamas will not. And I don't think that it's possible for Palestine to actually seize victory until the Comradores are out. 2, the international proletariat understand that Hamas is reactionary and anti-worker, along with the bourgeois state of Palestine and all other such organizations. Israel knows that too. That's why they supported them, so that the popular communist organizations would lose ground and thereby Palestine would lose international support. If the PLFP retook position as the leading faction, then they would get more international support, in fact. Otherwise, it's a question of military tactics and who has the superior commanders. But that doesn't really have to do with theory, and there's nothing saying that the party can't bring in the quality tacticians, right? Simply put, it's better in general. Maybe not in all things, as Hamas may have potentially superior fighters, I don't know. But in general, unquestionably, this would be the ideal scenario in this sort of situation. And it's effectively the PLFP becoming the leader of the military struggle rather than Hamas or the national bourgeoisie, and bringing in all international support. And that is what constitutes as revolutionary defeatism and the position that we should take in these sorts of situations. I hope this concretization of a current situation wherein principled positions can be undertaken even under the most stressed understandings, and an understanding of why we have those things helps understand what kind of situation we should be supporting as communists and how we should engage with varying conditions that we are exterior things that happen that the party needs to respond to. We'll talk about this in a more broad sense within the PowerPoint series that I will be creating for this, for the Foundations of Communist Organizing series. And I'll try to talk about the different kinds of situations that the proletariat will find itself in and why they should take what position they should take based on principles and tactics and stuff like that we have inherited by our historical experiences. I won't be able to get to everything, but this is definitely going to be one of those things. With that said, with that very, very longer than the actual reading, I believe, aside, tomorrow we will be going over the last in this series for the Third Communist International's Second Congress. There's much more after this in terms of the total series, 62 videos in total. The theses on parliamentarism presented by the communist abstentionist fraction of the Italian Socialist Party. As usual, if you want to see the quotations I derived the summary of this piece from, then you can go into the description below and find it. If you want to talk about the tactics of revolutionary defeatism and the position that communists should have as in response to these sorts of things, then please feel free to join the United Marxist Pact Discord server, also linked there. With that said, thanks for sticking around for those who have, and I hope to see you tomorrow.